China P. Arnold. On August 30, 2005, in Dayton, Ohio, 25-year-old China Arnold committed one of the most disturbing crimes in the state's history. That night, inside her Riverview Terrace apartment, Arnold placed her 28-day-old daughter, Paris Talley, into a microwave oven following a heated argument with her boyfriend over the baby's paternity. The infant suffered fatal thermal injuries, burned from the inside out, and died within moments. Arnold had a criminal past that included a conviction for abduction in 2000 and forgery in 2002. When she brought Paris to the hospital lifeless, police were initially unsure of the cause of death. It was only after the autopsy confirmed microwave exposure that investigators moved forward, and Arnold was arrested in November 2006 and charged with aggravated murder. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, incarcerated at the Dayton Correctional Institution. Claudia Sobro. In March 2007, in Newton Falls, Ohio, Major Carl Horig, a decorated U.S. Air Force Reserve pilot who had also flown missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, was found murdered inside his home. He had been shot 3 times, twice in the back and once in the head, with a .357 revolver. Investigators quickly discovered that his wife, Claudia Sobral, later known as Claudia Horig, had purchased that very weapon only days earlier and practiced firing it at a local range. Claudia, who was born in Brazil and later naturalized as a U.S. citizen, had married Carl in Las Vegas in June 2005 after meeting him online. The marriage unraveled almost immediately, marked by heavy arguments, emotional turbulence, and claims of erratic behavior. Carl told friends about his decision to divorce her, a decision that Claudia feared would strip her of both financial security and immigration stability. On March 12, 2007, before Carl could leave for work, Claudia carried out her plan. After shooting him inside their home, she abandoned his body at the bottom of the stairs and fled the country. Using Carl's airline credentials, she boarded flights that carried her first to New York and then on to Brazil. Within hours, she was beyond the reach of American law enforcement. For years, the case was stalled by Brazil's constitutional protection against extraditing its own citizens. But U.S. authorities uncovered that Claudia had renounced her Brazilian citizenship when she became a naturalized American in 1999. In 2013, Brazil officially revoked her Brazilian nationality, and in 2016, the Supreme Court of Brazil confirmed that ruling, removing her legal shield. After more than a decade as a fugitive, Claudia was extradited back to Ohio in January 2018 to face trial. In January 2019, she went before a Trumbull County jury for the charge of aggravated murder with a firearm specification. She admitted on the stand that she had killed Carl, but insisted she acted out of despair and humiliation. She was found guilty, and on February 8, 2019, Claudia Horig was sentenced to life in prison, with parole eligibility only after 28 years. She was transferred to the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, where she remains incarcerated. Mackenzie Sharilla. In July 2022, a deadly crash occurred in Strongsville, Ohio, that left the entire community in shock. 17-year-old Mackenzie Sharilla drove her Toyota Camry at more than 100 miles per hour down Alameda Drive, a dead-end street that ended in a brick wall. In the car with her were her boyfriend, 20-year-old Dominic Russo, and his friend, 19-year-old Davian Flanagan. The impact was catastrophic. Both young men died instantly, while Mackenzie herself survived with serious injuries and was pulled from the wreckage alive. Investigators later determined that this was no accident, after surveillance footage showed the car accelerating without hesitation, and the vehicle's data recorder revealed the accelerator was fully depressed with no evidence of braking and even a slipper wedged against the gas pedal. Prosecutors described the act as intentional, pointing to Mackenzie's troubled relationship with Dominic. In November 2022, after a lengthy investigation, Sharilla was arrested and charged with 12 counts, including 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, drug possession, and possessing criminal tools. She was found guilty on all major counts in July 2023, concluding the crash was deliberate and calculated. On August 21, 2023, Judge Russo sentenced Sharilla to 2 concurrent life sentences, with the possibility of parole only after 15 years. Cristel A. Candelario. It began in Cleveland, Ohio, in June 2023, when Cristel Candelario, a 31-year-old mother, made a choice that would shock the nation. She left her 16-month-old daughter, Jalen, alone inside their home while she went on vacation. For 10 days, the toddler was left without food, water, or care, trapped in her playpen as the summer heat pressed on. When Candelario finally returned, the baby was found unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to a heartbreaking scene of the child dead from starvation and severe dehydration. Investigators quickly pieced together the timeline, and neighbors told authorities they hadn't seen Candelario or the baby for days. It became clear this was no accident, but a deliberate neglect. Police arrested Candelario on June 16, 2023, charging her with aggravated murder and child endangerment. The cruelty of the case stood out. Not just the death, but the abandonment itself. A mother choosing leisure over the life of her only child. On March 18, 2024, in Cuyahoga County, Cristel Candelario was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to aggravated murder. She showed little emotion as the judge handed down the maximum punishment. Today, she serves her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. Heather Nicole Matthews. On the eve of Christmas 1992, Dayton, Ohio was shaken by a string of murders carried out over 3 days by a group known as the Downtown Posi. Among them was Heather Nicole Matthews, who had recently been released from prison and was only 20 years old at the time. On December 24th, Heather, along with 16-year-old Laura Taylor, lured 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson to his home on Prescott Avenue with the promise of having sex. Once they were inside, they held Wilkerson, tied him up, and Marvalis Keene shot him in the chest, while Taylor shot him in the head. The group then took his belongings and left his body behind. That same evening, Heather and the others confronted 18-year-old Danita Gillette at a payphone on Neal Avenue. She was forced to remove her shoes before she was shot multiple times. Her jacket, shoes, and backpack were taken. Heather's former boyfriend, Jeffrey Wright, was also targeted and shot 4 times in the legs, though he survived. On Christmas Day, Taylor lured her ex-boyfriend, 19-year-old Richmond Maddox, into driving with her. As Keene, Smith, and Heather followed behind, Maddox tried to speed away when he noticed what was going on, but Taylor then shot him in the head, killing him instantly. The following day, December 26th, the group entered the shortstop mini-market. One of the clerks, Sarah Abram, was shot in the head by Keene, and she later died of her injuries. A customer, Jones Pettis, was also shot, but he miraculously survived. Later that night, 2 acquaintances of the group, 16-year-old Wendy Cottrell and 18-year-old Marvin Washington, were lured to a gravel pit and executed out of fear they might talk to police. On December 26th, police noticed the suspects driving a stolen Dodge Shadow. Officers arrested Keene, Heather, Taylor, and Smith, bringing the killing spree to an end. In 1993, Heather Matthews accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. She pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated murder and other charges. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, totaling 194 years in prison, with parole eligibility only after serving 53 years. She remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio. Laura Jean Taylor. In the same Dayton case, Laura was one of the Downtown Posi group members. She shot her ex-boyfriend while he was driving, and he died before the car crashed into the roadside. While Heather Matthews accepted a plea deal and was given a life sentence, Keene was sentenced to death on December 10, 1993, and was executed years later. Laura Jean Taylor, though just 16 at the time of the crimes, was tried as an adult, and in early 1994 she was convicted and sentenced to 145 years to life in prison. Records from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction confirm that Laura Jean Taylor is still serving her sentence at Dayton Correctional Institution. Nicole Dr. In the early hours of August 27, 2003, A fire tore through a home in Lorain, Ohio. Inside, 4-year-old Jacob Dr. was found dead, while his mother, Nicole Dr., escaped without injury. At first, neighbors and authorities believed it was a tragic accident, but investigators soon determined the fire had been deliberately set with gasoline. The most chilling discovery was that Jacob showed no signs of smoke inhalation. He had died before the fire ever touched him. As a child, Nicole Dr. herself had survived a house fire that left her badly burned, but decades later suspicion fell on her as the orchestrator of another fire. This time it was one that took her own son's life. Investigators uncovered troubling details. Nicole had been struggling financially and had taken out a life insurance policy on her son, Jacob. The narrative of a grieving mother began to collapse under the weight of mounting evidence. Police arrested Nicole in 2003 and charged her with aggravated murder, aggravated arson, child endangerment, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. In October 2005, she was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. 3 years after her sentence, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld her conviction but overturned the death sentence, ruling that the trial judge had improperly limited what her attorneys could present during the mitigation phase. On June 3, 2010, Nicole was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, currently incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio. Sydney Nicole Powell. On March 3, 2020, Akron police were called to a quiet neighborhood after a frantic emergency call revealed a violent struggle. Inside the Powell family home, 19-year-old Sydney Nicole Powell had attacked her mother, 50-year-old Brenda Powell. Investigators determined that Sydney struck her mother in the head with a cast-iron skillet and then stabbed her nearly 30 times in the neck and upper body. At the time of the assault, Brenda, who worked as a child life specialist at Akron Children's Hospital, was on the phone with university staff, and they overheard the attack unfold before contacting authorities. When officers arrived, Brenda was gravely wounded, and she was quickly transported to Summa Akron City Hospital, where she later died from her injuries. Sydney was arrested at the scene and charged with murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. Prosecutors argued that the motive stemmed from Brenda confronting her daughter about her academic failures and arranging a disciplinary meeting with university officials, a confrontation that Sydney violently tried to silence. She was found guilty on September 20, 2023, and 8 days later, on September 28, Judge Kelly McLaughlin sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 15 years. In December 2024, the 9th District Court of Appeals reversed the conviction, opening the door for a possible second trial that is yet to be scheduled. Brooklyn Frazee. In September 2023, Brooklyn Frazee and her boyfriend Darrell Scott Donahoe were involved in an altercation that escalated into a chase. Frazee was driving an SUV while Donahoe rode his motorcycle through Scioto County roads, including Shumway Hollow, Swagger Valley, and Old Gallia, before reaching U.S. Route 52. Witnesses saw Frazee's SUV strike Donahoe's motorcycle, causing him to crash. Evidence later showed that Donahoe was dragged under the SUV for about 58 feet, and Frazee then backed over him. Bystanders lifted the SUV with car jacks in an attempt to save him, but Donahoe died from blunt force trauma, including 14 fractured ribs, lacerations to the liver, and internal bleeding. At the scene, Frazee claimed that Donahoe had wrecked in front of her and that she was only trying to catch him to warn him about his motorcycle's kickstand dragging, but toxicology results showed that Frazee had methamphetamine in her system, and investigators found Suboxone in her possession. In October 2023, Frazee was indicted on 12 counts, including murder, aggravated vehicular homicide, felonious assault, inducing panic, operating a vehicle under the influence, and leaving the scene. She was found guilty on all counts, and on August 16, 2024, Judge Kuhn sentenced her to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 34 years. Donna Marie Roberts. On December 11, 2001, in Howland Township, Ohio, 56-year-old Robert Fingerhut was shot to death inside his home. Investigators later determined the murder had been planned by his ex-wife Donna Marie Roberts, together with her lover Nathaniel Jackson. At the time, Jackson had just been released from prison 2 days earlier, and their correspondence through letters and phone calls had laid out the plan to kill Fingerhut. Evidence showed that Roberts gave Jackson access to the house, provided him with a mask and gloves, and kept in close contact as the conspiracy unfolded. The motive was rooted in financial gain. Fingerhut had life insurance policies worth more than $500,000, and Roberts stood to collect as the beneficiary. On January 16, 2002, Roberts was arrested and charged with complicity in aggravated murder, conspiracy, aggravated burglary, and aggravated robbery. At trial in Trumbull County, prosecutors presented letters, phone records, and witness testimony linking her directly to the crime. In 2003, she was convicted and sentenced to death, making her the only woman on Ohio's death row. Since then, her case has returned multiple times to the Ohio Supreme Court because of sentencing errors. Her death sentence was vacated and reimposed in 2007 and again in 2014. In June 2020, the Ohio Supreme Court granted a stay of execution while further appeals moved forward. In 2025, a federal appeals court ruled that Roberts must receive new sentencing hearings due to judicial bias and procedural violations, although her conviction for the murder of Robert Fingerhut remains intact. Donna Roberts is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, where she remains the only woman on the state's death row. Angela Jo Wagner. On April 21 and 22, 2016, 8 members of the Roden family were found shot to death in 4 separate homes across Pike County, Ohio. The killings shocked the state because of both the scale of the violence and the deliberate way it was carried out. The investigation stretched for more than 2 years before authorities could identify the members of the Wagner family: George Billy Wagner III, his wife Angela Jo Wagner, and their sons George Wagner IV and Edward Jake Wagner, as the conspirators behind the massacre. All 4 were arrested in November 2018 and charged in connection with the murders. The motive, prosecutors later revealed, was a custody dispute between Jake Wagner and Hannah Mae Roden, one of the victims and the mother of Jake's young daughter. Investigators determined that Angela Wagner played a central role in the planning. She helped draft false custody documents and took part in the conspiracy that ultimately led to the slaughter of the Roden family. Angela Wagner pleaded guilty on September 10, 2021 to charges including conspiracy to commit aggravated murder. As part of her plea, she admitted her role in the plot, avoided a potential death sentence, and agreed to testify against other family members. On December 30, 2022, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison with no possibility of early release, though she received credit for 6 years she had already served since her arrest. She is currently incarcerated under the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. Emil L. Weaver. In April 2015, at Muskingum University in New Concord, Ohio, Emil Weaver gave birth inside the Delta Gamma Theta sorority house bathroom. Instead of seeking help, she placed the newborn girl into a trash bag and left her outside, behind the house, where the infant suffocated. Investigators later determined the child had been born alive. Weaver tried to cover her tracks, but blood in the bathroom raised immediate suspicion among sorority members, leading to a swift call to authorities. Prosecutors revealed that Weaver had concealed her pregnancy from nearly everyone around her, and evidence introduced at trial included a text she sent shortly after the birth stating, "No more baby." In 2016, after a jury trial in Muskingum County, Weaver was convicted of aggravated murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. Judge Mark Flegel sentenced her to life in prison without parole, adding additional consecutive sentences for the other convictions. Years later, the original sentence was vacated and a new sentencing hearing was ordered. She was resentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 20 years. Brittany Pilkington. In Bellefontaine, Ohio, a series of child deaths that once appeared to be tragic coincidences was later revealed to be deliberate acts. Brittany Pilkington, who was born into an abusive and unstable environment, married Joseph Pilkington, a much older man with whom she had 3 sons, 4-year-old Gavin, infant Niall, and 3-month-old Noah. Between July 2014 and August 2015, each of the boys was found dead, one after another, inside the Pilkington home. At first, authorities believed the deaths might be medical in nature, but when Noah died in August 2015, suspicions turned into direct questioning. Brittany confessed to smothering her sons with blankets. In her videotaped statements, she explained that jealousy and resentment had driven her actions. She felt her husband favored the boys over her and their daughter, and she believed her sons would grow up to be abusive like their father. She was initially charged with aggravated murder and facing a possible death sentence, but her case stretched on for years, and finally, on November 19, 2019, Brittany Pilkington pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder for Gavin and Noah, and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter for Niall, and in exchange the death penalty was dropped. The court sentenced her to 37 years to life in prison, 7 years for the manslaughter count, and 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life for the murders. Teresa Katomsky. In Ashtabula County, Ohio, the case of Teresa Katomsky shocked the entire community when her husband, Raymond Katomsky, a 65-year-old retired corrections officer, collapsed inside his Jefferson Township home on August 15, 2009. He was rushed to the hospital but died the next day, August 16. Toxicology tests revealed that Ray had ingested a lethal amount of ethylene glycol, the chemical compound commonly found in antifreeze. Suspicion quickly fell on Teresa, as investigators uncovered that the marriage had been marked by tension and disputes, and testimony later showed that Ray had confided to friends that he feared Teresa might try to harm him. The evidence pointed to poisoning, and in March 2014, nearly 5 years after Ray's death, Teresa was arrested and charged with murder. She was sentenced on July 30, 2015 to an indefinite prison term of 15 years to life. She is serving that sentence today in the custody of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. Jessica Groves. Jessica Groves and her husband Daniel Groves lived in rural Scioto County, Ohio. On January 10, 2019, their son Dylan was born at Southern Ohio Medical Center. Both mother and child tested positive for drugs at birth, and Dylan suffered withdrawal symptoms. Because of this, Children's Services immediately placed him into foster care, and not long after, a judge allowed Dylan to be returned to his father under strict conditions, including that Jessica receive treatment and not live in the home. Dylan was last seen alive on March 28, 2019, during a caseworker's visit. In April, Children's Services lost contact with the family, and a missing person report was filed on April 30th. On June 10, 2019, investigators arrived at the Groves home, and after a brief standoff and repeated evasions, Jessica and Daniel were arrested. And 2 days later, on June 12, police discovered Dylan's body in a 30-foot well near the family's property in Otway. His body was wrapped in plastic and blankets, placed inside milk crates chained together, secured with padlocks, zip ties, and weighted down with rocks and an anchor-type object. The autopsy revealed multiple broken bones at different stages of healing, including fractures to his skull, ribs, arm, and leg. Toxicology showed methamphetamine and amphetamine in his system. The coroner ruled his death as homicidal violence of undetermined etiology. The couple were tried in January 2020, and Jessica admitted in court that she caused the injuries, though at times she claimed it was accidental. On January 10, 2020, the day that would have marked Dylan's first birthday, both parents were convicted. Jessica Groves was found guilty on all 11 counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, child endangerment, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Daniel Groves was convicted on all charges except aggravated murder. Judge Mark Kuhn sentenced Jessica Groves to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 32 additional years. Daniel Groves received 47 years to life, with a possibility of parole after several decades. Today, Jessica Groves is housed at the Dayton Correctional Institution, listed among its most notorious inmates. Erica Stefanko. On the night of June 20, 2012, Ashley Biggs, a 25-year-old Domino's pizza delivery driver and U.S. Army veteran, was dispatched to deliver an order to a vacant business parking lot in New Franklin, Ohio. But that call that sent her there had not come from a customer. It had been made by Erica Stefanko, who was married at the time to Chad Cobb, Ashley's ex-boyfriend and the father of her daughter. Ashley had been locked in a bitter custody dispute with Cobb, and that conflict had fueled years of animosity. When Ashley arrived, she was ambushed by Cobb, who used a stun gun, assaulted her, and strangled her to death with a zip tie. He then left her body in a remote field. Erica's role was not in the killing itself, but in setting the trap. She placed the call that brought Ashley to the ambush site and gave Cobb the opportunity to carry out the murder. Cobb pleaded guilty in February 2013 to aggravated murder, kidnapping, robbery, and related charges. He admitted to the killing in exchange for avoiding a death sentence and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For several years, Erica remained free, but investigators continued to pursue the case. Finally, in November 2019, she was arrested at her home in Doylestown, Ohio, and charged with aggravated murder and related offenses. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. However, in July 2022, an appeals court overturned the conviction because key testimony from Cobb had been given via Zoom during the COVID-19 pandemic, raising constitutional concerns. On January 31, 2024, she was found guilty once more and received the same punishment imposed at her first trial. Timika Eggleton. In Cleveland, Ohio, the life of 3-year-old Curtis Witcher ended in a way no child should ever face. On June 14, 2023, his mother, 31-year-old Timika Eggleton, walked into a store near East 79th Street and Euclid Avenue with Curtis in his stroller and reported that he was unresponsive. Emergency crews rushed the boy to the hospital, but doctors could not save him. An autopsy later revealed that Curtis's death was a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to his head, neck, and torso. He had severe bruising and lacerations that investigators said were consistent with physical abuse. The tragedy deepened when the backstory came to light. Curtis had spent more than 2 years in foster care with a family who wanted to adopt him. His foster parents raised him from the time he was an infant, and their attorney warned the court of Eggleton's abusive behavior, dishonesty, and manipulation. Still, in March 2023, juvenile court judge Allison Nelson Floyd returned custody to Eggleton, saying it was in the child's best interest, and within just 3 months, Curtis was dead. She pleaded guilty to murder, felonious assault, and child endangerment, and was sentenced on July 22, 2024, to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after she serves between 31 and 35 years. Tariana Pascal. On April 29, 2023, Cleveland State University assistant professor Todd Morgan was found dead in his Hudson home. Police discovered he had been shot 7 times in his bedroom, and investigators recovered shell casings, wine bottles, and bloody footprints leading out the back door. Authorities soon identified 32-year-old Tariana Pascal as a suspect. Investigators said digital evidence linked her to Morgan, including Bumble activity, Cash App transactions, DNA from cigars, and phone records. Court filings also revealed a $50 Cash App transfer to Morgan on the morning of the killing. Pascal was indicted in May 2023, and in September 2024, she entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder with a gun specification. On September 19, 2024, Tariana Pascal was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 23 years. She was also ordered to be placed on Ohio's Violent Offender Registry. Katrina Layton. In February 2017, 28-year-old Shannon Graves of Youngstown, Ohio, disappeared, and her family grew alarmed as weeks passed with no word. The truth would only come to light months later when her dismembered body was discovered hidden in a freezer inside a Campbell home. Investigators said the freezer belonged to Arturo Novoa, Shannon's boyfriend, and his new partner, Katrina Layton. Detectives uncovered that Novoa had murdered Shannon on February 24, 2017. He dismembered her body, attempted to dissolve parts using acid, and with Layton's help concealed her remains. Layton did not stop at helping to cover up the killing. She slid into Shannon's life, using her credit cards, driving her car, and even caring for her dog. To friends and neighbors, it was as if Shannon had vanished while another woman stepped into her place. By July 2017, authorities arrested both Novoa and Layton and convicted Novoa of murder, abuse of a corpse, and related charges. He was sentenced to 48 years to life in prison for the killing and desecration of Shannon's body. Layton pleaded guilty in January 2020 to 4 counts of tampering with evidence, 3 counts of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of abuse of a corpse. And on January 29, 2020, she was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Sandra K. Inman. In March 2011, 25-year-old Summer Inman was abducted in Logan, Ohio. She was strangled with a zip tie, and her body was later discovered hidden in a septic tank behind a church. Investigators quickly focused on her estranged husband, William Inman II, along with his parents, William A. Inman and Sandra K. Inman. All 3 were implicated in the abduction and killing. The family had a history of conflict with Summer, and the separation between her and William was marked by bitterness and control. Sandra Inman was charged in connection with the crime, and her defense initially raised questions about her competency and the possibility of an insanity plea. But as the case moved forward, the evidence tying her to the murder grew overwhelming. She pleaded guilty to charges of murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. As part of a plea agreement, the court sentenced her to a term of 15 years to life in prison, with parole eligibility after serving the minimum term. Her husband, William Inman, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with additional consecutive sentences for related crimes. If you enjoyed this and want to see more interesting videos, I'm going to be posting every day on this channel. I would really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Thank you very much.